Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode. We have with us today Ben Mills. Hi, Ben. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
We have Ben here on the show today because he is a Scrum Master, but also a project manager and a pastor. And that's a very unique journey that he's sharing with us today. He's starting his career as a Scrum Master and decided to share his journey with us so that we could all benefit from what he's learned. So let's dive right into it, Ben. Tell us, what attracted you in the Scrum Master role?
Well, my family and I moved to Nashville about 5 years ago. You mentioned I'm a pastor, so I took a pastoral role here. The friends that we met here all work in IT because Nashville's a big healthcare IT area. So as I talked to my friends about their positions, they would suggest that I look into the agile methodology and mention works like Scrum and Waterfall. And I really didn't know too much about it until this past year. So we would kind of mention it, kind of talk about it. And I just, as this year kind of get started, I started kind of looking at what my next career might possibly be. So I started doing some research and really fell in love with the Scrum framework. I have worked a lot in unhealthy environments, and Scrum felt like a step towards a healthy relationship with everyone involved, from the product owner, from the developers to customers to stakeholders, all that stuff. So I narrowed on the Scrum Master because of the servant leader. I think it's called the true leader now, correct? I think they changed the language of that.
Yeah, it's a leader who serves. I guess that's what they are talking about now.
Yeah. So I like that type of. My job in the nonprofit organization is all about servant leadership, but in response to the people who attend the church. So it's response to people who we're serving the people who come to our church and our congregation. So the transition from what I do to a work environment felt very natural. I had a month off in September and started the journey to look to know more. So decided that I wanted to get certified. So I worked through Scrum Alliance to complete it. As my month off neared to an end, I wanted to know more. So I actually went ahead and did the product owner certification as well.
Very useful, of course, because you will work with a lot of product owners in your role as a Scrum Master, obviously.
Yeah, and just to kind of get a clear understanding of all the roles involved, right? And the idea that the company believes in transparency and helping the team be a better version of themselves is something I really could stand behind. So that's what really kind of drew me into that Scrum Master role.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about the Scrum Master role and of course joining the Scrum Master practitioner community, what are the main things that you try to apply and try to get as a position as a Scrum Master? Like, what are the things that you think? You talked about servant leadership, of course, but that's quite broad, right? Like, break it down for us. What does that mean in practice? How do you translate your specific experience in servant leadership into the Scrum Master role?
I think a lot of it is, the manifesto or the four things. What is it? People before product.
Yeah, it's people and interactions, or individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
Yes, that comes a lot in my mind, like people before whatever. So, helping people be better versions of themselves. So that's something we do. So when I got back to work, I decided to start thinking as my volunteer team as collaborative was one of the things that I started to really kind of focus on and started to think about that. So all ideas, all suggestions, all concerns, basically anything was allowed. And so I used a digital whiteboard and presented questions and asked the team to share. And I kind of use this as my backlog of sorts. That's really kind of hard because I'm trying to still figure out what that all is, honestly. So as a project manager, I would say I was a steel fabrication. And that steel fabrication is basically a traditional waterfall effect. You have an end date, you have a start date, and everything has to work to get to that date. And then it's more about, it really is about the process. I guess in my experience, and I haven't done project management for about 5 years, but in my experience when I was trying to do it, I'm more relational with people. And so I would always try to build good relationships with people. Unfortunately, in that kind of industry, sometimes relationships kind of can easily be severed when something doesn't go the right way. And so I always try to maintain good relationships and that type of thing. But that waterfall effect was really something I was discouraged by because there's so many variables and things. And of course, you're looking at months of a project or even a year project versus, the 2 weeks or whatever. So what I kind of did is, as I was learning these things, I tried to take back what I could learn. I kind of did the opposite effect. I took what I learned and see how I can implement it into what I was actually doing. So in my last couple months here, just like I discussed, I had the volunteer team. I just basically said everything is allowed. And we kind of put a digital whiteboard and put everything down, and I would just kind of see what the similar things were, and that became my backlog. And I was starting to think about common issues and gather information on the direction that that I thought we needed to go based upon the information I was receiving. So I acted kind of as the project owner and presenting the team with the areas that we were going to work on for that week. So hypothetically, I wanted to work like on a 1 week sprint. So if I'm using the terminology, in order to start making some changes and move on toward the next thing. So as the week came to a close, I would switch to the Scrum Master role. So and be the encourager for the team, and I would direct. I would be directing the concerns. So like the impediments that were happening in our team to make things that was making it hard for us to function. But at the same time, I would take all the good things in what we wrote and send them to the team and say, hey, all these are good things that we're learning from this. And I would encourage them to work together and keep presenting ideas. Unfortunately, because my time's coming to an end, it's difficult to see how that would continue to play out. But if I were to stay on, I would have implemented some other ideas that I learned and could modify to fit the context, mainly like the sprint review, a look at what we're doing and ask difficult questions. Because I think a lot of times what we do is, as a team, we're so focused on what we want to do, especially in my context, that we forget we still have students and parents. We still have other areas. So what looks good to us might not look good to them. And so we needed to figure out a best way to say, are we building what we want, or are we building what the youth ministry needs? Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. So thinking from the perspective of those who we are serving, right?
Exactly.
So as you were thinking about this, so you were putting in practice all that you had learned in the Scrum Master training, of course. And as you thought about this, I'm sure that one of the questions in your mind was, okay, so but how do I now use this experience to serve me in my job hunt, right? Because I'm looking for a job as a Scrum Master. And what are the things that you have, tried to apply or highlight or include in your CV or in the interviews, if you've had any? Like, how have you brought that up in the conversation with potential employers?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't had, the job market's really weird. So I've applied at a lot of different places, but I've gotten no callbacks. And part of it is because my experience is in ministry, I think. And so I've been reading a lot of articles about, like, if you don't word everything right, basically computers reject you before people do. So I haven't had the opportunity to really put that into focus. So what I've tried to do is try to put the right wording in my cover letter or in my application or resume. But I'll be honest with you, that's the difficult part for me right now. I don't know exactly what to do or how to do it, and I've never had the opportunity to actually try it. Does that make sense?
And of course, you've heard that the computers do the first screening, and that's absolutely true, right? Like one of the tips that I share with the people that if people ask me about this, is you always make sure you include all the keywords that are on the job application, because of course that's the first thing they'll check, right? Do you have all the keywords? And as you work through the process, like what other insights, what other lessons have you collected about breaking through into the Scrum Master role?
The thing that keeps coming up is networking. And so just trying to build that network of people. What I found is that a lot of people in the Scrum Master community are actually wanting to help. It seems to be a very natural place for them. They want to do the best that they can for you. And so my personality is, I'm more of an introvert. So it's kind of harder for me to try to do that network and kind of reach out and say, hey, trying to get into this, what can you do to help me? But it seems to be the best way. And so I've tried some things from meetup.com where I would go on there, and everybody's just really nice. And like when you say things, they're wanting to answer, they want to help you. But it seems like the main thing, especially in this type of company, because Scrum's probably maybe 20 years old as far as like an actual or how they do things. And then you got companies asking for like 10 years of experience. And it just seems like impossible to get in when you have zero experience at any level.
Well, they were asking for 10 years experience when Scrum was 5-year-old. So that's nothing new. That's actually one of the very basic anti-patterns, right? Because they probably have that in in a template that, for this kind of position, ask for 10 years experience. But, Scrum was, well, at least the first few books were published in the last years of the 1990s, early 2000s. And of course, that means it's 20 years old. And I remember, looking at job ads in the teens when Scrum was like 10 years old, and people were still asking for 10 years experience. Well, of course, as it's easy to understand, Scrum was at first a niche thing. Not a lot of people knew about it. Nowadays, it's kind of a given that people will have at least some familiarity with Scrum, but not back then. And they were still asking for 10 years experience, right? As the saying goes, there's no harm in asking.
Yeah. And it's just, and so the other thing is trying to like just kind of what I did is one of the things that someone told me, said, start implementing it, even though you don't have a Scrum set up. Start implementing the ideas and sharing those ideas as well. And so that's my next step. I wanted to be done with the church. I'm done with here soon with the church. And then I will start kind of pushing, like, I've taken some screenshots and explain, I want to explain it and try to push it out there a little bit. And so it seems like LinkedIn's that kind of community is really good with that kind of understanding. Some of the other job search sites are a little less interactive, so it's hard to do that kind of thing. So LinkedIn seems to be the main place to kind of do that. And my goal is just to keep applying and then just find a way in, even if it's outside of Scrum, to get myself into the IT so that I can get myself into Scrum. So,
and it's interesting that you're saying that. So first of all, the networking aspect, which you mentioned, then getting into the sites, communicating and actually knowing people. Of course, online it's easier, right? Because you don't have to be face to face with someone. You can just message them, ask them a question, suggest an idea, request feedback on your own stories and the things that you have to share. We've had lately quite a few people here on the podcast that are going through a similar journey that you're describing. So we had Alyosha together with two other previous guests talking about how to break into the Scrum Master role. I'll put the link on the show notes for people to go and listen to that. There's a lot of concrete tips there as well. And as we are recording this just this week, Mariana Trigo, one of our guests, is sharing how she does it, because she actually is doing that as a service to the potential Scrum Masters out there. She comes from a completely different industry, not IT related at all, but then broke into IT and then the Scrum Master role as example. So definitely there's a lot of people interested in that journey, right? And maybe many started just like you did by listening to friends about what their experience was and how the work atmosphere was different in that kind of companies. And I can totally relate to, and many of our guests have related also that story of kind of finding that the waterfall approach is kind of demeaning to people, kind of stressful and puts a lot of strain on the relationships, while the agile approach is the opposite. Although it can still be stressful, that doesn't necessarily go away, but it's a lot more focused on something you said, right? People before whatever. Right? It's about the people and the relationships. Now, for our listeners that are out there thinking about, should I apply for a Scrum Master role? Should I start my journey? Maybe as you put it, by taking the Certified Scrum Master course or the Certified Scrum Master and Certified Product Owner course. What would you give those people that are just now, where you were maybe a year ago or 2 years ago? What words of advice and also counseling do you have for them?
I would say the first thing is to just do your research and make sure this is something that you want to do. And in a sense of, if you're not into it in the way that they want it, it seems like Scrum not done well. It's bad Scrum, and it only leads to even a possible worse situation in some ways, because you're trying to do two different types of methodologies and they're kind of conflicting. So do your research, understand that that's who you are. And it may be Scrum Master is not where you are, project owner might be where you are, but in something in that. So the second thing is get into a community, find that community as quickly as you can, because as you do your research, finding the right people to ask the right questions and maybe even networking for potential jobs, the sooner you can do that, it seems like the better you'll be off.
Absolutely. And actually, networking is a great way to escape the automated screening that computers do, because once you know people and they are looking for someone and you have a relationship of trust with them, they are much more likely to consider you for that position. Another tip that we discussed in Alyosha's episode in more detail was the idea that we could work with open source projects, right? Like volunteer time to work with software teams that are working on open source projects, and therefore be helpful to them, be of service to them, and get the practice, and of course get the resume, because some of those open source projects might be high visibility, as an example.
Yeah, and I would say also, like kind of what I did too, is can you use some of those skills in your own context? Just because you're learning it doesn't mean it has to just be dormant until you have the job. Start using those skills. Start being, because the more you use a skill, the more you master that skill. So start using that skill in your own context, even if it's not pure, because you'll get a better knowledge. As when you get into it, you'll be less lost and ready to roll. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also the other thing is listen to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of articles.
Yeah.
And for sure, LinkedIn is a great place to start by joining some of the groups and asking around, like, what should I read? I'm interested in this particular skill. What do you recommend? And so on. Now, Ben, you have a very different and unique perspective on the Scrum Master role because of your background, right? You were a project manager in a waterfall industry, but you were also a pastor for many years. So from your perspective, looking at the Scrum Master role, what is that role? How would you define it?
Well, I see it as being about the people. And so my role has always been about the people. So it's about the students that I've been trusted with, the volunteers that I work with, my coworkers. It's all about those people. So servant leader is a natural role for me. And I would think that for others, this could be difficult because there's always been a shift from my process to people. So, and I can see where new Scrum Masters who have been part of, whom even been a developer, can easily go back to a process because that's what they understand. So for me, to define the role is you got to change the way you think, in a sense of we're so ingrained that we have to get product out the door. Everything we do is get product out the door as quickly as we can. And of course that never loses it. But when we change it to about the people, then we can make the better version of people who we're working with. So it's about that transparency, being honest. So for me, it's just that servant leader portion of that role that really highlights.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually something that was already, even in the early life of Scrum, already one of the key aspects, right? Like the idea of building the servant leadership and the servant leader culture. So as you went through your journey, I imagine you read a lot and you heard and you talked with friends and acquaintances and tried to network. So you probably have a good set of ideas of where people like you were about a year ago or whatever it was should start. So if you have like one resource, could be a book, a blog, a podcast, whatever, that you would recommend our listeners to dive into to learn more about this journey of how to get started, what would that be?
Obviously I think your podcast is a great way because it gives different perspectives in different ways about what's going on. But also there was two books. One was How to Do
Twice the Work in Half the Time by Jeff Sutherland.
Yeah, so that gives a great breakdown of processes of what it is, but it also gives some real world examples of what they do. The other thing was called Creativity Inc. by one of the founders of Pixar. And even though they don't call their methodologies or framework Scrum or Agile or anything like that, you really see that their concepts are basically the same, and you can kind of almost hear how beneficial the things that Scrum stand for are working with Pixar. And so that was really helpful for me to like actually have this organization that kind of already follows this framework and how it works well in there. So those two books really were very helpful for me as far as like one, understanding it, second, how it's implemented.
And if you think about those two books, but think about one story, like one story that, that stuck with you. Could be from any of the books, or it could be even a story from each of the books. It doesn't matter. But one story that stuck with you that kind of perhaps motivated you to continue that journey of breaking into the Scrum Master role. Can you share that with us?
Pixar, the Creativity Inc. really focused a lot on transparency. And that's something that's really been something that I've struggled with in companies, is the lack of transparency, the lack of where we're at, or the lack of where the person's at, even personally, like in those types of things. And I remember them sharing the different stories of like asking direct questions and being very honest and say it's just this whole culture of like, we're just everything's out there. If you can't be honest, then you don't need to work here, right? So if you can't be transparent, you don't need to. That's not part of our culture. And what they were saying was, is the more transparent we become, the better we can see where we need to. The better we see the work that needs to be done, and we can help you. You can help us, and we can be better together, right? And I can't remember the specific story, but there was a lot about like, and you kind of see it in different places that I've worked, people trying to hold on to something, right? And so it's hard to be transparent when you're trying to hold on to something because you're afraid and vulnerable to what might be exposed, right? But by exposing it, you might actually build a better product because it might show, the impediments, or it might show the things that are not working well in it. And someone might be able to speak into it, even though we might not like it. It could actually build a better product or a better story or whatever that. So that was really something that really came out to me, and that something that I value is transparency. So
yeah, that reminds me of a kind of a mantra at one of the companies that I worked, which was always tell me the bad news first. Right? Because that's the thing that we often tend to hide. Like, I mean, a very common example is the project manager report that is green, 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 and then at the end it's red, right?
Yeah.
When in fact it should be actually red, 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 red until you can prove it's green. But because we take that approach, we are hiding information, i.e., not being transparent, and therefore not being able to act, right? So in the way I translate what you said in my mind is that by not being transparent, we're preventing the improvement process.
Yeah. And I have a quick story from my job as a project manager. I didn't get the project manager because I was going to be a project manager. I took some time off ministry, and that's how I went to a place that I worked at as a kid. And so I kind of worked my way into project management. And the way that they taught you project management was it just kind of threw you into it. So one of my first jobs, there was a deliverable that needed to be there. And I made a mistake. So there's some miscommunication, and I decided not to disclose the truth. So I was kind of hoping that something would happen so that something would get there and that magically everything would work out, even though all the information said it wasn't going to work out. It caused a lot of havoc. It actually got me thrown off that job, and it became a huge lesson for me in that moment, because I was like, you know what? If I would just been honest about it, I would have got yelled about it, but people would have respected me more. We would have been better for it at the end of it. But because I was trying to hide information, because I was protecting myself and what integrity I thought I had, and then even the aftermath of the frustration and anger that I felt, it could all been done in a moment, and we would all been better for it in the end. So for me, that's always been the first thing. Like you said, you don't always want to start out with bad news first, but you always kind of have to, let's put it out there, and then let's focus on the good things too, because we can always kind of go back and we can make the good things, make the bad things better too. So
yeah, exactly. And we as Scrum Masters have a huge role in creating an atmosphere and an environment where people feel comfortable doing what you just said you didn't do back then, right? Like opening up and saying, hey, I mean, you don't even need to say I screwed up. You could just say, hey, this happened. I don't know what to do. Can you help me?
Yeah.
Right. Like one of the most powerful things we can do as Scrum Masters is exactly that, is helping people ask for help. Because the moment people are willing to ask for help, then things can get better, right? That if we're not asking for help, and on top of that, we're not being transparent, then of course, all hell can break loose, and things usually happen just like in your story. Magic usually doesn't come to the rescue.
it doesn't, and it only makes things worse. And again, like there was probably 10 times that I could have just said, this is not going to happen. We could have corrected it weeks ahead of time versus the moment. And when that moment happened, it caused, because working in steel, everything has to build on something. So I stopped the building process that could have been adjusted later on. So
yeah, and a great story for us as Scrum Masters to think about and kind of try to implement, right? Like have that opportunity, allow people to talk about what's not going so well so that we can adjust. Very good, Ben. I mean, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the show. Really interested to hear about how your journey goes. So maybe we'll get you back at some point when you have some more stories to share. So thank you very much. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing, Ben?
You can find me on LinkedIn and the work that I'm doing. I'm going to try to start sharing things after this kind of my journey at where I'm at comes to a close. Also, if anybody's hiring, I'm available.
There you go. There you go. And of course, you already did share a lot in this episode. So thank you for that, Ben. Thank you for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.